please visit Librivox.org. Recording by Kirk Ziegler, Lake Placid, Florida. 30 Ghost Stories by various authors. Story 1, The Filleted Hand by Guy de Maupassant. One evening about 8 months ago, I met with some college comrades at the lodgings of our friend Louis R. We drank punch and smoked, talked of literature and art, made jokes like any other company of young men. Suddenly the door flew open, and one who had been my friend since boyhood burst in like a hurricane. "Guess where I come from," he cried. "I bed on the Maybill," responded one. "No," said another, "you're too gay. You come from borrowing money, from burying a rich uncle, or from pawning your watch." "You're getting sober," cried a third, "and as you scented the punch in Louis's room, you came up here to get drunk again." "You're all wrong," he replied. "I come from P in Normandy, where I have spent 8 days, and whence I have brought one of my friends, a great criminal, whom I ask permission to present to you." With these words he drew from his pocket a long, black hand, from which the skin had been stripped. It had been severed at the wrist. Its dry and shriveled shape, and the narrow, yellowed nails, still clinging to the fingers, made it frightful to look upon. The muscles, which showed that its first owner had been possessed of great strength, were bound in place by a strip of parchment-like skin. "Just fancy," said my friend. "The other day they sold the effects of an old sorcerer, recently deceased, well known in all the country. Every Saturday night he used to go to witch gatherings on a broomstick. He practiced the white magic and the black, gave blue milk to the cows, and made them wear tails like that of the companion of St. Anthony. The old scoundrel always had a deep affection for this hand, which, he said, was that of a celebrated criminal, executed in 1736 for having thrown his lawful wife headfirst into a well, for which I do not blame him, and then hanging in the belfry the priest who had married him. After this double exploit he went away, and during his subsequent career, which was brief but exciting, he robbed 12 travelers, smoked a score of monks in their monastery, and made a seraglio of a convent." "But what are you going to do with this horror?" we cried. "Eh, parbleu, I will make it the handle of my doorbell and frighten my creditors." "My friend," said Henry Smith, a big phlegmatic Englishman, "I believe that this hand is only a kind of Indian meat, preserved by a new process. I advise you to make bouillon of it." "Rail not, messieurs," said, with the utmost sang-froid, a medical student who was 3/4 drunk, "but if you follow my advice, Pierre, you'll give this piece of human debris Christian burial, for fear lest its owner should come to demand it. Then, too, this hand has acquired some bad habits, for you know the proverb, 'Who has killed will kill.'" "And who has drank will drink," replied the host as he poured out a big glass of punch for the student, who emptied it at a draught and slid dead drunk under the table. His sudden dropping out of the company was greeted with a burst of laughter, and Pierre, raising his glass and saluting the hand, cried, "I drink to the next visit of thy master." Then the conversation turned upon other subjects, and shortly afterward each returned to his lodgings. About 2 o'clock the next day, I was passing Pierre's door. I entered and found him reading and smoking. "Well, how goes it?" said I. "Very well," he responded. "And your hand?" "My hand? Did you not see it on the bell pull? I put it there when I returned home last night. But apropos of this, what do you think? Some idiot, doubtless to play a stupid joke on me, came ringing at my door towards midnight. I demanded who was there, but as no one replied, I went back to bed again and to sleep. At this moment the door opened, and the landlord, a fat and extremely impertinent person, entered without saluting us. "Sir," said he, "I pray you take away immediately that carrion which you have hung to your bell
Master,
pull.
we are not alone.
Unless you do this, I shall be compelled to ask you to leave." "Sir," responded Pierre with much gravity, "you insult a hand which does not merit it. You know that it belonged to a man of high breeding?" The landlord turned on his heel and made his exit without speaking. Pierre followed him, detached the hand and affixed it to the bell cord hanging in his alcove. "That is better," said he. "This hand, like the brother, all must die, of the Trappists, will give my thoughts a serious turn every night before I sleep." At the end of an hour I left him and returned to my own apartment. I slept badly the following night and was nervous and agitated, and several times awoke with a start. Once I imagined even that a man had broken into my room, and I sprang up and searched the closets and under the bed. Towards 6 o'clock in the morning I was commencing to doze at last, when a loud knocking at my door made me jump from my couch. It was my friend Pierre's servant, half-dressed, pale, and trembling. "Ah, sir," cried he, sobbing, "my poor master! Someone has murdered him." I dressed myself hastily and ran to Pierre's lodgings. The house was full of people disputing together, and everything was in a commotion. Everyone was talking at the same time, recounting and commenting on the occurrence in all sorts of ways. With great difficulty I reached the bedroom, made myself known to those guarding the door, and was permitted to enter. 4 agents of police were standing in the middle of the apartment, pencils in hand, examining every detail, conferring in low voices and writing from time to time in their notebooks. 2 doctors were in consultation by the bed on which lay the unconscious form of Pierre. He was not dead, but his face was fixed in an expression of the most awful terror. His eyes were open their widest, and the dilated pupils seemed to regard fixedly, with unspeakable horror, something unknown and frightful. His hands were clenched. I raised the quilt which covered his body from the chin downward, and saw on his neck, deeply sunk in the flesh, the marks of fingers. Some drops of blood spotted his shirt.
I've got a bad
At
feeling
that
about
moment
this.
one thing struck me. I chanced to notice that the shriveled hand was no longer attached to the bell cord. The doctors had doubtless removed it to avoid the comments of those entering the chamber where the wounded man lay, because the appearance of this hand was indeed frightful. I did not inquire what had become of it. I now clipped from a newspaper of the next day the story of the crime with all the details that the police were able to procure. A frightful attempt was made yesterday on the life of young M. Pierre B. student, who belongs to one of the best families in Normandy. He returned home about 10 o'clock in the evening, and excused his valet, Bovin, from further attendance upon him, saying that he felt fatigued and was going to bed. Towards midnight, Bovin was suddenly awakened by the furious ringing of his master's bell. He was afraid and lighted a lamp and waited. The bell was silent about a minute, then rang again with such vehemence that the domestic, mad with fright, flew from his room to awaken the concierge, who ran to summon the police, and at the end of about 15 minutes, 2 policemen forced open the door. A horrible sight met their eyes. Furniture was overturned, giving evidence of a fearful struggle between the victim and his assailant. In the middle of the room, upon his back, his body rigid, with livid face and frightfully dilated eyes, lay motionless young Pierre B., bearing upon his neck the deep imprints of 5 fingers. Dr. Bourdian was called immediately, and his report says that the aggressor must have been possessed of prodigious strength, and have had an extraordinarily thin and sinewy hand, because the fingers left in the flesh of the victims 5 holes like those from a pistol ball, and had penetrated until they almost met. There is no clue
My
to the
senses
motive
have
of the
picked up
crime or
something.
to its perpetrator. The police are making a thorough investigation. The following appeared in the same newspaper next day. Monsieur Pierre B., the victim of the frightful assault of which we published an account yesterday, has regained consciousness after 2 hours of the most assiduous care by Dr. Bourdian. His life is not in danger, but it is strongly feared that he has lost his reason. No trace has been found of his assailant. My poor friend was indeed insane. For 7 months I visited him daily at the hospital where we had placed him, but he did not recover the light of reason. In his delirium strange words escaped him, and, like all madmen, he had one fixed idea. He believed himself continually pursued by a spectre. One day they came for me in haste, saying he was worse, and when I arrived I found him dying. For 2 hours he remained very calm, then suddenly, rising from his bed in spite of our efforts, he cried, waving his arms as if a prey to the most awful terror, "Take it away! Take it away! It strangles me! Help! Help!" Twice he made the circuit of the room, uttering horrible screams, then fell face downward, dead. As he was an orphan, I was charged to take the body to the little village of P. in Normandy, where his parents were buried. It was the place from which he had arrived the evening he found us drinking punch in Louis Sar's room, when he had presented us the filleted hand. His body was enclosed in a lead coffin, and 4 days afterwards I walked sadly beside the old curé, who had given him his first lessons, to the little cemetery where they dug his grave. It was a beautiful day, and sunshine from a cloudless sky flooded the earth. Birds sang from the blackberry bushes where many a time when we were children we had stolen to eat the fruit. Again I saw Pierre and myself creeping along behind the hedge and slipping through the gap that we knew so well, down at the end of the little plot where they buried the poor. Again we would return to the house with cheeks and lips black with the juice of the berries we had eaten. I looked at the bushes. They were covered with fruit. Mechanically I picked some and bore it to my mouth. The curé had opened up his breviary and was muttering his prayers in a low voice. I heard at the end of the walk the spades of the gravediggers who were opening the tomb. Suddenly they called out. The curé closed his book, and we went to see what they wished of us. They had found a coffin. In digging, a stroke of the pickaxe had started the cover, and we perceived within a skeleton of unusual stature, laying on its back, its hollow eyes seeming yet to menace and defy us. I was troubled, I know not why, and almost afraid. "Hold!" cried one of the men. "Look there! One of the rascal's hands has been severed at the wrist. Ah, here it is!" And he picked up from beside the body a huge withered hand and held it out to us. "See," cried the other, laughing, "see how he glares at you, as if he would spring at your throat to make you give back his hand." "Go," said the curé, "leave the dead in peace and close the coffin. We will make poor Pierre's grave elsewhere." The next day all was finished, and I returned to Paris, after having left 50 francs with the old curé for masses to be said for the repose of the soul of him whose sepulchre we had troubled. End of story 1.
I don't know. I don't know if I want to keep listening to these. I don't know if it's the story itself or if it's the audio of the of the. I listen to a lot of audio. I don't know if it was just that story. I am up. I'm gonna stop it. Yucca. Supplied. Files and there. my... I love my... Start the next book. See if it's good at all. We're gonna start book 4.
Story 2 of 30 Ghost Stories by various authors. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. The Parlor Car Ghost. All draped with blue denim, the seaside cottage of my friend Sarah Pine. She asked me to go there with her when she opened to have it set in order for the summer. She confessed she felt a trifle nervous at the idea of entering it alone, and I'm always ready for an excursion. So much blue denim rather surprised me, because blue is not complementary to Sarah's complexion. She always wears some shade of red by preference. She perceived my wonder. She is very nearsighted and therefore sees everything by some sort of sixth sense. "You do not like my portieres and curtains and table covers," she said. "Neither do I, but I did it to accommodate. And now he rests well in his grave, I hope." "Whose grave, for pity's sake?" "Mr. J. Billington Price's." "And who is he? He doesn't sound interesting." "Then I will tell you about him," said Sarah, taking a seat directly in front of one of those curtains. "Last autumn I was leaving this place for New York, traveling on the fast express train known as the Flying Yankee. Of course, I thought of the Flying Dutchman and Wagner's musical setting of the uncanny legend, and how different things are in these days of steam, etc. Then I looked out of the window at the landscape, the horizon that seemed to wheel in a great curve as the train sped on. Every now and then I had an impression at the tail of the eye that a man was sitting in a chair 3 or 4 numbers in front of me on the opposite side of the car. Each time that I saw this shape I looked at the chair and ascertained that it was unoccupied. But it was an odd trick of vision. I raised my lorgnette, and the chair showed emptier than before. There was nobody in it, certainly. But the more I knew that it was vacant, the more plainly I saw the man, always with the corner of my eye. It made me nervous. When passengers entered the car, I dreaded lest they might take that seat. What would happen if they should? A bag was put in the chair. That made me uncomfortable. The bag was removed at the next station. Then a baby was placed in the seat. It began to laugh as though someone had gently tickled it. There was something odd about that chair. 13 was its number. When I looked away from it, the impression was strong upon me that some person sitting there was watching me. Really, it would not do to humor such fancies. So I touched the electric button, asked the porter to bring me a table, and taking from my bag a pack of cards, proceeded to divert myself with a game of patience. I was puzzling where to put a 7 of spades. "Where can it go?" I murmured to myself. A voice behind me prompted, "Play the 4 of diamonds on the 5, and you can do it." I started. The only occupants of the car besides me were a bridal couple, a mother with 3 little children, and a typical preacher of one of the straightest sects. Who had spoken? "Play up the 4, madam," repeated this voice. I looked fearfully over my shoulder. At first I saw a bluish cloud, like cigar smoke, but inodorous. Then the vision cleared, and I saw a young man whom I knew by a subtle intuition to be the occupant, seen and not seen, of chair number 13. Evidently he was a traveling salesman, and a ghost. Of course, a drummer's ghost sounds ridiculous. They're so extremely alive. Or else you would expect a dead drummer to be particularly dead and not walk. This was a most commonplace-looking ghost, cordial, pushing, businesslike. At the same time, his face had an expression of utter despair and horror, which made him still more preposterous. Of course it is not nice to let a stranger speak to one, even on so impersonal a topic as a 4 of diamonds. But a ghost, there can't be any rule of etiquette about talking with a ghost. My dear, it was dreadful. That forward creature showed me how to play all the cards, and then begged me to lay them out again, in order that he might give me some clever points. I was too much amazed and disturbed to speak. I could only place the cards at his suggestion. This I did so as not to appear to be listening to the empty air, and be supposed to be a crazy woman. Presently the ghost spoke again, and told me his story. "Madam," he said, "I have been riding back and forth on this car ever since February 22, 1890. 7 months and 11 days. All this time I have not exchanged a word with anyone. For a drummer, it's pretty hard, you may believe. You know the story of the Flying Dutchman? Well, that is very nearly my case. A curse is upon me and will not be removed until some kind soul. But I'm getting ahead of my text. That day there were 4 of us, traveling for different houses. One of the boys was in wool, one in baking powder, one in boots and shoes, and myself in cotton goods. We met on the road, took seats together, and fell into talking shop. Those fellows told big lies about their sales, Washington's birthday though it was. The baking powder man raised the amount of the bills of goods which he had sold better than a whole can of his stuff could have done. I admitted the straight truth, that I had not yet been able to make a sale. And then I swore, not in a light-minded, chipper style of verbal trimmings, but a great, round, heaven-defying oath, that I would sell a case of blue denim on that trip if it took me forever. We became dry with talk, and when the train stopped at Rivermouth, we went out to have some beer. It is good there, you know. Pardon me. I forgot I was speaking to a lady. Well, we had to run to get aboard. I missed my footing, fell under the wheels, and the next thing I knew they were holding an inquest over my remains, while I, disemboweled, was sitting in the corner of the undertaker's table, wondering which of the coroner's jury was likely to want a case of blue denims. Then I remembered my wicked oath, and understood that I was a soul doomed to wander until I could succeed in selling that bill of goods. I spoke once or twice, offering the denims under value, but nobody noticed me. Verdict: accidental death. Negligence of deceased. Railroad corporation not to blame. Deceased got out for beer at his own risk. The other drummers took charge of the remains, and wrote a beautiful letter to my relatives about my social qualities and my impressive conversation. I wish it had been less impressive at that time. I might have lied about my sales, or I might have said that I hoped for better luck. But after that oath there was nothing for it. Back and forth on this road, in chair number 13, to all eternity. Nobody suspects my presence. They sit on my knees. I'm playing in luck when it is a nice baby as it was this afternoon. They pile wraps, bags, even railway literature on me. They play cards under my nose, and what duffers some of them are. You, madam, are the first person who has perceived me, and therefore I venture to speak to you, meaning no offense. I can see that you are sorry for me. Now, if you recall the story of the Flying Dutchman, he was saved by the charity of a good woman. In fact, Senta married him. Now I'm not asking anything of that size. I see that you wear a wedding ring, and no doubt you make some man's happiness. I wasn't a marrying man myself, and naturally I'm not a marrying ghost. And that has nothing to do with the matter anyway. But if you could, I don't suppose you would have any use for them, but if you were disposed to do a good turn, solid Christian charity, I should be everlastingly grateful, and you may have that case of denim at $72.50. And that quality is quoted today at $80. Does it go, madam? The speech of the poor ghost was not very eloquent, but his eyes had an intense, eager glare, which was terrible. Something, pity, fear, I do not know what, compelled me. I decided to do without that white and gold evening cloak, Instead, I gave $72.50 to the ghost and took from him a receipt for the sum, signed J. Billington Price. Then he smiled contentedly, thanked me with emotion, and returned to chair number 13. Several times on the journey, although I did not perceive him again, I felt dazed. When the train arrived at New York, and I, with the other passengers, dismounted, it seemed to me that a strong hand passed under my elbow, steadying me down the steps. As I walked the length of the station, my bag, not heavy at any time, appeared to become weightless. I believed that the parlor car ghost walked beside me, carrying the bag, whose handle still remained in my other hand. Indeed, once or twice I thought I felt the touch of cold fingers against mine. Since then I have no reason to suppose that the poor ghost is not at rest. I hope he is. But I never expected nor wished for the blue denims. The next day, however, a dray belonging to a great wholesale house backed up to our door and delivered a case of denims, with a receipted bill for the same. What was I to do? I could not go about selling blue denims. I could not give them away without exciting comment. So I furnished the cottage with them, and you know the effect on my complexion. Pity me, dear, and credit me, frivolous woman as I am, with having saved a soul at the expense of my own vanity. My story is told. What do you think about it? End of story 2.
That was pretty good. Okay. That was cute. That's a pretty good, I'm okay with that story. Handle the third one. Ah, shit. At home. Book.
Story 3 of 30 ghost stories by various authors. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Ghost of Buckstown Inn
This
by
one's
Arnold
quieter.
M. Anderson. Several drummers sat in the lobby exchanging yarns. It was Rodney Green's turn, and he looked wise and began his tale. I don't claim by any means that the belief in ghosts is a general thing in Arkansas, but I do say that I had an experience out there a few years ago. It was late in the fall, and I happened to be in the village of Buckstown, which desecrates a very limited portion of the state. The town is as small and dirty a place as I ever saw, and the Buckstown Inn was not much above the general character of the place. The region is inhabited by natives who still cling to all sorts of foolish superstitions. The inn, in the antebellum days, was kept by one who was said to be the meanest and most crabbed of mortals. The old demon was as miserly as he was mean, and all his narrow life he hoarded his filthy lucre with fiendish greed. Report had it also that he had even murdered his patrons in their beds for their money. What the facts actually were, I don't know, but even so to this day, the old inn is held in suspicion. A lingering effect of former horrors still clouds its memory. The present proprietor, Bunk Watson, his real name is Bunker, I believe, is an altogether different sort of chap, a southern style in fact, one of those shiftless, heedless, happy-go-lucky mortals who love strong whiskey, and who chews an enormous quid of black tobacco and smokes a corncob pipe at the same time. When the former keeper shuffled off, his property fell to a distant relative, the present keeper, who, with his family, immediately moved in from a neighboring hamlet and took possession. It was well known that the old proprietor had accumulated considerable wealth during his sojourn among the living, but all efforts to discover any treasure upon the premises had failed, and now the idea of ever finding it was practically given up. As far as Bunk was concerned, the matter troubled him little. He had a hard-working wife who ran things the best she could under the circumstances, and saw that his meals were forthcoming at their respective intervals. What more could he wish? Why should he care if there was a treasure buried upon his place? Indeed, it would have been a sore puzzle for him to know what to do with a fortune unless perhaps his wife came to his aid. Among the stories that hovered in the history of the Buckstown Inn was one which involved a ghost. In the room where the former keeper had died, peculiar noises were heard at unearthly hours, sighing, moaning, and in fact, all the other indications which point to the existence of ghosts were said to be present. On account of this, the chamber had long since been abandoned. I listened with keen interest to the wonderful tales about the haunted rooms, and then suddenly resolved to investigate, to sleep in that chamber that very night and see for myself all that was to be seen. I told Buck of my purpose. He shook his head, shrugged his shoulders, but instead of warning me and offering a flood of protests, as I expected, he merely took his pipe from his mouth, let fly a quart or so of yellowish juice from between a pair of brown-stained lips, and, opening one corner of his white mouth, lazily called out, "Jane." His wife appeared, and he intimated that I should settle the matter with the old woman. The prospect of a fee persuaded the wife, and off she went to arrange for my bed in that ill-fated room. At 9 o'clock that evening I bid the family good night, took my candle, ascended the rickety stairs, and entered the Chamber of Horrors. The atmosphere was heavy, and had a peculiar odor that was not at all pleasing. However, I latched the door and was soon in bed. Having propped myself up with pillows, I was prepared to await the coming of the ghost. Overhead, the dusty rafters, which once had experienced the sensation of being whitewashed, but were now a dirty, yellowish color, were hung with a fantastic array of cobwebs. The flickering light of the candle reflected upon the walls and against the ceiling a pyramid of grotesque shapes, and with this effect being continually disturbed by the swaying cobwebs, the whole caused the room to appear rather ghostly after all, and especially so to an imaginative mind. I waited and waited for hours, it seemed, but still no ghost. Perhaps it was afraid of my candlelight, so I blew it out. No sooner had I done this and settled back in bed again than a white hand appeared through the door, then a whole figure. At last the ghost had come, a white and sheeted ghost. It had come right through the door, although it was locked, and now advanced toward the bed. Raising its long white arm, it pointed a bony finger at me, and then commanded, "Come with me." Thereupon it turned from the door, while instantly I jumped out of bed to follow. Some unseen power compelled me to obey. The door flew open, and the ghost led me down the stairs, through long halls into the cellar, through mysterious underground corridors, upstairs again, in and out rooms which I never dreamed were to be found in that old rambling inn. Finally, through a small door in the rear, we left the house. I was in my sleeping garments, but no matter, I had to follow. The white form, with a slow and measured tread, and as silent as death, led the way into the orchard. There, under a tree at the farther end, it pointed to the ground, and in the same ghostly tones before used said, "Here you will find a great treasure buried." Then the ghost disappeared, and I saw it no more. I stood dazed and trembling. Upon recovering my wits, I started to dig, but the chill of the night air and the scantiness of my night robes made such labor impracticable. So I decided to leave some mark to identify the place and come round again at daybreak. I reached up and broke off a limb. Overcome with my night's exertions, I slept the next morning until a loud rapping on my door and a croaking voice warned me that it was noon. I had intended to leave Buckstown Inn that day, but prompted by curiosity and anxious to investigate, I unpacked my gripsack for a comfortable stay. You must understand that this was my first experience with a ghost, and I feared I might never see another. At breakfast my lady waited on me in silence. though once I detected her eyes following me with a peculiar expression. She wanted to ask me how I enjoyed the night, but I would not gratify her by volunteering a word. My host was more outspoken. "Reckon you didn't get much sleep," said he with a queer smile. "Did you hear anything?" I asked. "Well, I did, yes," he said with a drawl. "But you didn't disturb me any. I knew you'd have trouble when you went into that room to sleep." That afternoon I slipped out to the tree, but to my amazement I found that the twig I had broken from the branches was gone. Finally I found under the lower trunk of an apple tree an open place from which a small branch had evidently been wrested. But on looking further, I discovered that every apple tree in the orchard had been similarly disfigured. "More mysterious than ever," I said, "but tonight shall decide." That night I pleaded weariness, which no one seemed inclined to question, and sought my couch earlier. "Going to try it again?" asked my host. "Yes, and I'll stay all winter, but what I'll get even with that ghost," I said. That night I kept the candle burning until midnight, when I blew it out. Instantly the room was flooded with a soft light, and at the foot of the bed stood my ghost, the identical ghost of last night. Again the bony finger beckoned, and a sepulchral voice whispered, "Follow me." I sprang from the bed, but the figure darted ahead of me. It flew through the doorway and down the stairs, and I after it. At the foot of the stairs an unseen hand reached forward and caught my foot, and I fell sprawling headlong. But in a second I was on my feet and pursuing the ghost. It had gained on me a few yards, but I was quicker, and just as we reached the outside door I nearly touched its robes. They sent a chill through my frame, and I nearly gave up the pursuit. As it passed through the doorway, it turned and gave me one look, and I caught the same malignant light in its eyes that I remembered from the night before. In the open orchard I felt sure I could catch it, but my ghost had no intention of allowing me any such opportunity. To my disgust, it darted backward and into the house, slamming the door in my face. In my frenzy of fear and chagrin, I threw myself against the oaken door with such force that its rusty old hinges yielded, and I landed in the big front room of the inn, just in time to see the white skirts of the ghost flit up the stairs. Upstairs I flew after it, and into an old chamber. There, huddled in a corner, I saw it. In the minute's delay it had secured a lighted candle, and as I entered, it advanced to daunt me with bony arm upraised to a great height. "Caught!" I cried, throwing my arms around the figure, and I made the acquaintance of a real live ghost. The white robes fell, and I saw revealed my hostess of Buckstown Inn. Next morning, when I threatened to call the police, she confessed to me that she had masqueraded as a ghost to draw visitors to the out-of-the-way old place, and that she found its tale of being haunted highly profitable to her. End of story 3.
That was great.
This might sting a little.
One cast takes care of two. I mean, that's good information to know. Okay. Hey. Let's see. Start the next. I didn't really care for that one so much. So far, out of 1, 2, and 3, I did like the parlor car ghost. That one was alright. Story number 4.
Story 4 of 30 ghost stories by various authors. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. The Burglar's Ghost. I'm not an imaginative man, and no one who knows me can say I have ever indulged in sentimental ideas upon any subject. I am rather predisposed, in fact, to look at everything from a purely practical standpoint, and this quality has been further developed in me by the fact that for 20 years I have been an active member of the detective police force at Westford, a large town in one of our most important manufacturing districts. A policeman, as most people will readily believe, has to deal with so much practical life that he has small opportunity for developing other than practical qualities, and he is more apt to believe in tangible things than in ideas of somewhat superstitious nature. However, I was once under the firm conviction that I had been largely helped up the ladder of life by the ghost of a once well-known burglar. I have told the story to many, and have heard it commented upon in various fashions. Whether the comments were satirical or practical, it made no difference to me. I had a firm faith at that time in the truth of my tale.
Wrong button.
18 years ago, I was a plainclothes officer at Westford. I was then 23 years of age, and very anxious about two matters. First and foremost, I desired promotion. Second, I wished to be married. Of course, I was more eager about the second than the first, because my sweetheart, Alice Moore, was one of the prettiest and cleverest girls in the town. But I put promotion first for the simple reason that with me promotion must come before marriage. Knowing this, I was always on the lookout for a chance of distinguishing myself, and I paid much attention to my duties that my superiors began to notice me, and foretold a successful career for me in the future. One evening in the last week of September, 1873, I was sitting in my lodgings wondering what I could do to earn the promotion which I so earnestly wished for. Things were quiet just then in Westford, and I am afraid I half wished that something dreadful might occur if I only could have a share in it. I was pursuing this train of thought when suddenly I heard a voice say, "Good evening, officer." I turned sharply around. It was almost dusk and my lamp was not lighted. For all that, I could see clearly enough a man who was sitting by a chest of drawers that stood between the door and the window. His chair stood between the drawers and the door, and I concluded that he had quietly entered my room and seated himself before addressing me. "Good evening," I replied. "I didn't hear you come in." He laughed when I said that, a low chuckling, rather sly laugh. "No," he said, "I dare say not, officer. I'm a very quiet sort of person. You might say, in fact, noiseless. Just so." I looked at him narrowly, feeling considerably surprised and astonished at his presence. He was a thickly built man with a square face and heavy chin. His nose was small but aggressive. His eyes were little and overshadowed by heavy eyebrows. I could see them twinkle when he spoke. As for his dress, it was in keeping with his face. He wore a rough suit of woolen or frieze. A thick, gaily colored belcher neckerchief encircled his bull-like throat, and in his big hands he continually twirled and twisted a fur cap, made apparently out of the skin of some favorite dog. As he sat there smiling at me and saying nothing, it made me feel uncomfortable. "What do you want with me?" I asked. "Just a little matter of business," he answered. "You should have gone to the office," I said. "We're not supposed to do business at home." "Right you are, Governor," he replied, "but I wanted to see you. It is you that's got to do my job. If I had seen the superintendent, he might have put somebody else on it. That wouldn't have suited me. You see, officer, you're young, and naturally eager for promotion, eh?" "What is it you want?" I inquired again. "Ain't you eager to be promoted?" he reiterated. "Ain't you now, officer?" I saw no reason why I should conceal the fact, even from this strange visitor. I admitted that I was eager for promotion. "Ah," he said, with a satisfied smile, "I'm glad of that. It'll make you all the keener. Now, officer, you listen to me. I'm a-going to put you on to a nice little job. I dare say you'll be a sergeant before long. You will. You'll be complimented and praised for your clever conduct in this affair. Mark my words if you ain't." "Out with it," I said, fancying I saw through the man's meaning. "You're going to split on some of your pals, I suppose, and you want a reward." He shook his head. "A reward," he said, "wouldn't be no use to me at all. No, not if it was £1,000. No, it ain't nothing to do with reward. But now, officer, did you ever hear of a light-toed Jim?" Light-toed Jim! I should have been a poor detective if I had not. Why, the man under that sobriquet was one of the cleverest burglars and thieves in England, and had enjoyed such a famous career that his name was a household word. At that moment there was an additional interest attached to him. He had been convicted of burglary at the Northminster Assizes in 1871, and sentenced to 10 years' penal servitude. After serving nearly 2 years of his time, he escaped from Portland, getting away in such clever fashion that he had never been heard of since. Where he was no one could say, but lately there had been a strong suspicion among the police that Light-toed Jim was at its old tricks again. Light-toed Jim? I repeated. I should think so. Why, what do you know about him? He smiled and nodded his head. Light-toed Jim, said he, is in Westford at this identical moment. Listen to me, officer. Light-toed Jim is a-goin' to crack a crib tonight. Said crib is the mansion of Miss Singleton, that rich old lady as lives out on Mapleton Road. You know her, awfully rich, with naught but women servants and animals about the place. There's some very valuable plate there. That's what Light-toed Jim's after. He'll get in through the scullery window about 1 a.m., then he'll pass through the back and front kitchens and into the butler's pantry, only it's a butleress, 'cause there ain't no men at all, and there he'll set to work on the safe. Some of his late pals in Portland gave him the tip about this 'ere job. How did you come to hear of it? I asked. Never mind, Governor. You wouldn't understand. Now, I want you to be up there tonight to nab Light-toed Jim red-handed, so to speak. It'll mean promotion for you, and it'll suit me down to the ground. You wants to be about and to watch him enter, then follow him and dog him. And he be armed, officer, for Jim'll fight like a tiger if you don't draw his teeth first. Now look here, my man, said I, this is all very well, but it's all irregular. You must tell me who you are and how you come to be in Light-toed Jim's secrets, and I'll put it down in black and white. I turned away from him to get my writing materials.
Ready for duty.
I was not a half a minute with my back to him, but when I turned around, he was gone. The door was shut, but I had heard no sound from it either opening or shutting. Quick as I thought, I darted to it, tore it wide open, and looked down the narrow staircase. There was no one there. I ran hastily downstairs into the passage and found my landlady, Mrs. Mariner, standing at the open door with a female friend. Mrs. Mariner, I said, breaking in upon their conversation, which way did that man go who came downstairs just now? Mrs. Mariner looked at me strangely. There ain't been no man come downstairs, Mr. Parker, said she. Leastways, not this good 3/4 of an hour, which me and Mrs. Higgins 'ere as have come out to take an airing. Her having been ironin' all this blessed day, has been standin' 'ere all the time and ain't never seen a soul. Nonsense, I said. A man came down from my room just now. The man you sent up 20 minutes since. Mrs. Mariner looked at me with an expression betokening the most profound astonishment. Mrs. Higgins sighed deeply. Mr. Parker, said Mrs. Mariner, I'm sorry to say it, sir, but you're either intoxicated or else you're a-sickening for brain fever, sir. There ain't no person entered this door, in or out, for nigh on to an hour, as me and Mrs. Higgins 'ere will take our Bible oaths on. I went upstairs and looked in the rooms on either side of mine. The man was not there. I looked under my bed, and of course he was not there. He must have gone downstairs. But then the women must have seen him. There was only one door to the house. I gave it up in despair and began to smoke my pipe. By the time I had drawn the last whiff, I decided that if anyone was intoxicated, it was probably Mrs. Mariner and Mrs. Higgins, and that my strange visitor had departed by the door. I was not going to believe that he had anything supernatural about him. I had no duty that night, and as the hours wore on, I found myself stern in my resolve to go up to Mrs. Singleton's house and see what I could make out of my informant's story. It was my opinion that my late visitor was a whilom pal of Light-toed Jim, and that having become aware of the latter's plot, he had, for some reason of his own, decided to split on his old chum. Thieves' disagreement is an honest man's opportunity, and I determined to solve the truth of the story told me. Lest it should come to nothing, I decided not to report the matter to my chief. If I could really capture Light-Toed Jim, my success would be all the more brilliant by being suddenly sprung upon the authorities. I made my plan of action rapidly. I took a revolver with me and went up to Mrs. Singleton's house. Fortunately, I knew the housekeeper there, a middle-aged, strong-minded woman, not easily frightened, which was a good thing. To her I communicated such information as I considered necessary. She consented to conceal me in the room where the safe stood. There was a cupboard close by the safe from which I could command a full view of the burglar's operations and pounce upon him at the right moment. If only my information was to be relied upon, there was every chance of my capturing the famous burglar. Soon after midnight, when the house was all quiet, I went to the pantry and got into the cupboard, locking myself in. There were 2 openings in the panel, through which of either I was able to command a full view of the room. My position was somewhat cramped, but the time soon passed away. My mind was principally occupied in wondering if I was really about to have a chance of distinguishing myself. Somehow there was an air of unreality about the events of the evening which puzzled me. Suddenly I heard a sound which put me on the alert at once. It was nothing more than the creaking of a board or opening of a door would make in a quiet house, but it sounded intensified to my expectant ears. I drew myself up against the door of the cupboard and placed my eye to the opening of the panel. I had oiled the key of the door and kept my fingers upon it in readiness to spring upon the burglar at the proper moment. After what seemed some time, I saw the gleam of light through the keyhole of the door opening into the pantry. Then it opened, and a man carrying a small lantern came gently into the room. At first I could see nothing of his face, but when my eyes grew accustomed to the hazy light, I saw that I had been rightly informed, and that the burglar was indeed no other than the famous Light-Toed Jim. As I stood there watching him, I could not help admiring the cool fashion in which he went to work. He went over to the window and examined it. He tried the door of the cupboard in which I stood concealed. Then he locked the door of the pantry and turned his attention to the safe. He set his lamp on a chair before the lock and took from his pocket as neat and pretty a collection of tools as I ever saw. With these he went quietly and swiftly to work. Light-Toed Jim was a somewhat slimly built fellow, with little muscular development about him, while I'm a big man with plenty of bone and sinew. If matters had come to a fight between us, I could have done what I pleased with him, but I knew that Jim would not chance a fight. Somewhere about him I felt sure there was a revolver, which he would use on the least provocation. My plan, therefore, was to wait until his back was bent over the lock of the safe, then to open the cupboard door noiselessly, and fall bodily upon him, pinning him to the ground beneath me. Before long the moment came. He was working away steadily at the lock, his whole attention concentrated on the job. The slight noise of his drill was sufficient to drown the faint click of the key in the cupboard door. I turned it quickly and tumbled right upon him, driving the tool out of his hands and tumbling him into a heap at the front of the safe. He uttered an exclamation of rage and astonishment as he went down, and immediately began to wriggle under me like an eel. As I kept him down with one hand, I tried to pull out the handcuffs with the other. This somewhat embarrassed me, and the burglar profited by it to pull out a sharp knife. He had worked himself around on his back, and before I realized what he was after, he was hacking furiously at me with his keen, dagger-like blade. Then I realized that we were going to have a fight for it, and prepared myself. He tried to run the knife into my side. I warded it off, but the blade caught the fleshy part of my left arm, and I felt a warm stream of blood spurt out. That maddened me, and I seized one of the steel drills laying there at hand and hit my man with such a blow over the temple that he collapsed at once and lay as if dead. I put the handcuffs on him instantly, and to make matters still more certain, I secured his ankles. Then I rose and looked at my arm. The knife had made a nasty gash, and the blood was flowing freely, but it was not serious, and when the housekeeper, who had just then appeared on the scene, had bandaged it, I went out and secured the help of the first policeman I met in conveying Light-Toed Jim to the office. I felt a proud man when I made my report to the inspector. "Light-Toed Jim," said he. "What, James Bland? Nonsense, Parker." But I took him to the cells where Jim was being attended to by the doctor. "You're right, Parker," he said. "That's the man. Well, this'll be a fine thing for you." After a time, feeling a little exhausted, I went home to try and get some sleep. The surgeon had attended to my arm, and told me it was but a superficial wound. It felt sore in spite of that. I had no sooner reached my lodgings than I saw sitting in my easy-chair the strange man who had called upon me earlier in the evening. He rose to his feet when I entered. I stared at him in utter astonishment. "Well, Governor," said he, "I see you've done it. You've got him square and fair, I reckon." "Yes," I said. "Ah," he said, with a sigh of complete satisfaction. "Then I'm satisfied. Yes, I don't know as how there's aught more I could say. I reckon that's how Light-Toed Jim and me's quits." I was determined to find out who this man was this time. "Sit down," I said. "There's a question or two I must ask you. Just let me get my coat off and I'll talk to you." I took my coat off and went over to the bed to lay it down. "Now then," I began, and looked around at him. I said no more, being literally dumbstruck. The man was gone. I began to feel uncomfortable. I ran hastily downstairs, only to find the outer door locked and bolted, as I had left it a few minutes before. I went back, utterly nonplussed. For an hour I pondered the matter over, but could neither make head nor tail of it. When I went down to the office next morning, I was informed that the burglar wanted to see me. I went to his cell, where he was lying in bed with his head bandaged. I had hit him pretty hard, as it turned out, and it was probable he would have to lie on the sick list for some days. "Well, Governor," said he, "you'd the best of me last night. You hit me rather hard that time." "I was sorry to have to do it, my man," I answered. "You would have stabbed me if you could." "Yes," he said, "I should. But I say, Governor, come a bit closer. I want to ask you a question. How did you know I was on that little job last night? For s'help me, there wasn't a soul knew a breath about it but myself. I hadn't no pals, never talked to nobody about it, never thought aloud about it, as I knows on. How came you to spot it, Governor?" There was no one else in the cell with us, and I thought I might find out something about my mysterious visitor of the night before. "It was a pal of yours who gave me the information," I said. "Can't be, Governor. No use telling me that. I ain't got no pals. Leastways, not in this job. Did you ever know a man like this?" I described my visitor. As I proceeded, Light-Toed Jim's face assumed an expression of real terror. Whatever color was in it faded away. I never saw a man look more thoroughly frightened. "Yes, yes," he said eagerly. "In course I know who it is. Why, that's Barksy Bill, as I'd pal with at one time. And what did he say, Governor? That he owed me a grudge? That we was quits at last?" "Right you are, 'cause he did owe me a grudge. I treated Bill very shabby indeed, and he swore solemn he'd have his revenge. On ye, Governor, what you see wasn't Barksy Bill at all, but his ghost, 'cause Barksy Bill's been dead and buried this 3 year. I was naturally very much exercised in my mind over this weird development of the affair, and I used to think about it long after Light-Toed Jim had once more retired into the seclusion of Portland. While he was in charge at Westford, I tried more than once to worm some more information out of him about the defunct Barksey Bill, but with no success. He would say no more than that Bill was dead and buried this 3 year, and with that I had to be content. Gradually I came to have a firm belief that I had indeed been visited by Barksey Bill's ghost, and I often told the story to brother officers, and sometimes got well laughed at. That, however, mattered little to me. I felt sure that any man who had gone through the same experience would have had the same beliefs. Of course I got my promotion and was soon afterward married. Things went well with me, and I was lifted from one step to another. In my secret mind I was always sure I owed my first rise to the burglar's ghost, and I should have continued to think so but for an incident which occurred just 5 years after my capture of Light-Toed Jim. I had occasion to travel to Sheffield from Westford, and had to change trains at Leeds. The carriage I stepped into was occupied by a solitary individual, who turned his face to me as I sat down. Though dressed in more respectable fashion, I immediately recognized the man who had visited me so mysteriously at my lodgings. My first feeling was one of fear, and I dare say my face showed it, for the man laughed. "Hello, Governor," said he. "I see you knew me as soon as you come in. You owes a deal to me, Governor, now don't ye, eh?" "Look here, my man," I said. "I've been taking you for a ghost these 5 years past. Now just tell me how you got in and out of my room that night, will you?" He laughed long and loud at that. "A ghost?" said he. "Well, if that ain't a good urn. Why, easy enough, Governor. I was a lodging for a day or two in the same house. It was easy enough when you know how, to open a door very quiet and slip out, too. But I followed you sharp and looked for you. Aye, Governor, but you looked down, and I'd gone up. You should have come up to the attics, and there you'd have found me. So you took me for a ghost. Well, I'm blowed." I told him what Light-Toed Jim had said in the cell. "Aye," said he. "I dare say, Governor. You see, 'twas this way. It weren't Jim's fault I wasn't dead. He tried to murder me, Governor, he did, and left me a lying for dead. So I says to myself when I comes round that I'd pay him out sooner or later. But after that I quit the profession, Jim's nasty conduct having made me sick of it. So I went in for honest work at my old trade, which was draining and pipe repairing. I was on a job of that sort in Westford, near Miss Singleton's house, when I seed Light-Toed Jim. I had a idea what he was up to, haven't heard of the plate, and I watches him 1 or 2 nights, and gets a notion how he was going to work the job. Then, of course, you being an officer and close at hand, I splits on him, and that's all. But you had got the time and details correct." "Oh, why, of course, Governor, I was an old hand, served many years at Portland, I have, and I knew just how Jim would work it, after seeing his preliminary observations. But a ghost, ha, 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 why, Governor, you must have been very green young officer in them days." Perhaps I was. At any rate I learned a lesson from the ci devant Barksey Bill, namely, that in searching a house it is always advisable to look up as well as down. End of story 4.
I don't know about that one. Okay. That is what she wrote for the day.